And our sixth speaker is Rosemary Signorelli, and Rosemary draws on her training and experience as a music therapist, a psychotherapist and occupational therapist in developing and providing early childhood services at STARTS. She combines dyadic psychosocial clinical interventions with community-based research and community development strategies. In her various professional capacity over the years, Rosemary has worked with people of all ages, very young children and their caregivers, people with diverse abilities and people from many different cultures and life experiences. All of this experience converges in her early childhood work with families from refugee backgrounds. And Rosemary tells us that she's quirky. And we're hoping that that will shine through in her presentation. Thank you and welcome, Rosemary.
I forgot to bring something quirky, so I've been outshone. All I can do is this. Hola, I've forgotten. Hola, buongiorno, bonjour, salam, marhaba, ciao, and I've forgotten all the other ones. And I was going to get my hair done again to look more like the picture, but I ran out of time. Now, when I looked at the keys to inclusion, all of them except the Aboriginal key are relevant, although I have to say I think there's a lot of parallel issues in terms of how we work with people from refugee communities, which may become evident later. You can see this is complex, and so I've got a lot of detail which I have to rush over. But I think this is the point about working with refugees, that there are so many ways to look at things, so many perspectives. What a wonderful lesson that was in the words we use. And that there are many keys and they all interlock, if you'll pardon the pun. So first, very briefly about the CALD key and respect for beliefs, cultures and language. I was very interested in what the gentleman was saying about doing things on their terms and in their way, and I think that's very, very important as we work with refugee communities. And so on this picture here, I've got consultation, joint goal setting. That's about building trust and collaboration. Quite a few people have talked about collaboration. And I talk about collaborative service design and delivery, which is actually about their terms and their way. And then, of course, we use interpreters. Language support is a human right. There are many ways to do it. It might be an interpreter, it might be translated materials. But I see interpreters as being part of this is dreadful, part of the intervention that I engage with children and families, that the interpreter is part of that. Of course, a lot of providers have bicultural workers, as we do as well, but sooner or later we need interpreters with some of the refugees. They're not people to be feared, they're professionals, they're colleagues. If we look at the nature of the services we might provide, in my research, refugee communities tend to have a preference for group interventions. There could be a lot of reasons for that. Stigma, for instance, not wanting their child to be standing out. Obviously, in most of your contexts, the children are in a group context. One of the challenges for refugees that come to your services, or that don't come to your services, more to the point, is that most refugee communities have not had playgroups, childcare, preschool. It hasn't been part of their cultural structure, and they have no idea, a lot of them, what that's about, why is it needed, how is it helpful. And that's one of the big challenges that I face. How can I help people to engage with services and be ready for school, as well as all the other benefits? In the work that I do with children, so children come to me who have been identified as having some difficulties. In fact, I have worked with some children who've actually been excluded from childcare, playgroup or preschool because of the behaviours they're manifesting. Now, that's not true of all early childhood services, and some have been really fantastic in working out ways to include and to help the children and collaborate. But that does happen. So I've had some of the expelled preschool attendees and childcare. So cultural transition is another very important thing I'll mention over and over again. So you can see many factors involved in looking at things from the point of view of the culture of origin. I have to confess, this is an area I still need to do some more work on and exploring, and I want to thank my colleague who's just reminded me of some things that are not on my slide, but that are real issues. So I've mentioned here that we are including any person that is seen to be the carer of the child in our sessions, male, female, grandparents, whoever. And they have a choice in the gender that they prefer for the worker or the interpreter. Not always the worker, because there are more women than men. We do have other programs that address gender issues, and that's really looking at the adults, adolescents and adults, and many of whom have actually been persecuted and tortured because of their sexual preference. And that leads to something I've not mentioned here, that a lot of parents are concerned about the way their children are playing. And the little boy who likes pink and plays with dolls, is that okay? And this is an issue that we need to talk through with parents. Participation of fathers, and also when I do research with different refugee communities, what are the family roles and who looks after little children in the community can be different. When we're doing assessment, the top 3 parts of this circle, we're looking at strengths and challenges. If we only look at strengths, we won't necessarily provide the interventions to help with the challenges. If we only look at challenges, obviously, you know what happens then. Our goals are to enhance trauma recovery, the child's development, their school readiness, and enhance the parent-child relationship, but also the community connection, which is vitally important for these people. We need to remember that refugee children that you see in your locations have been affected by trauma. Just because they're in the 0 to 5 age group does not mean they have not experienced trauma. They have multiple types of trauma, and this will be reflected in their behaviours and their development. In fact, compared to the 20% of the population who have a disability, according to my colleague here, in my clinical observations and in research with refugee communities, there will be 95% of 0 to 5-year-olds from refugee communities have a delay in at least 6 areas of development. This cannot be called disability. It is likely to be due to trauma, the effect of trauma on development, and the contexts in which they've been living. This is a real problem, and so many children are not going to childcare and preschool, so they're not getting opportunity to catch up, and so catching up is a big issue. Their behaviours can look like ADHD, autism and global developmental delay. So we have to be very careful of labels, and if you have a refugee child who looks like they have a disability, I suggest that you need to collaborate with a refugee service to look at, is that in fact a disability? Is it trauma? What is the best way for us to work together? And so we need to look at the social and systemic context that these children are coming from. Evidence-based practice, you've heard it. Where does the evidence come from? Most of evidence-based practice has been studied in Western individualistic cultures. So we have to first of all question that. But also we need to look at how we work with refugee families from a collectivist point of view, interpreters I've mentioned, readiness I've mentioned, collaboration is a very big thing. I've put up here that the children have a voice. The children have a voice through how they play, how they behave. That's how they are telling us where they're at. But we also need to give parents a voice. So if the child is struggling, let's talk to the parent. Let's find out what the parent sees as an issue, what they think is important. It comes back to their way. And don't forget to use interpreters when you're talking with the parents. But the community has to have a voice, which I didn't put on the slide. That's another lens. I do research with communities, and that is giving them the opportunity to tell me about their perspectives and their ways, so that we can then look at how we can work together to provide for the children in a way that will be culturally sensitive, that actually means something to the families, because they see it very differently. I've just listed a very few tips. I think you get these slides later. So obviously respect for language. I notice in your packages there's information about keywords, so that's one. Referral, get some input from refugee services about how you can work with the children. Thinking about triggers, so children's behaviour might be triggered by something you haven't even noticed. It might simply be the colour of the paint. It might be songs about boats, playing with boats. Child of mine, a child I know of, went on a school excursion recently where they all went on a boat trip, and this child was horrifically traumatised because he had come to Australia on a boat. So thinking about those things. Even just being bumped into in the schoolyard can trigger for children traumatic memories of being crowded in a boat or being in detention centres, etc. Or being held very tight while they're escaping. Lots of strategies for helping children with regulating their behaviour, and the visual schedules that someone mentioned are very, very useful for these children, along with a lot of things. I have to finish, but I think a very, very important thing is that we really need to work with the community. Let's give the community voice. Let's find out about the community these children are coming from and how they want to work. Yes, we can have multicultural events and welcoming activities, and that's great. But we also need to talk with communities about what childcare and preschool and playgroups are about. How does that relate to their community? How do they learn about our system and adapt so that the children can move forward in a completely different situation? And then from the research I've been doing and consulting with communities, we've been able to build trust. It has increased engagement in early childhood services. There's been significant improvement. If we work with 0 to 5-year-olds from refugee background, they can catch up in their development. And then those that were excluded, those few that have been excluded because their behaviours were just so extreme, have been able to return and be included again. So we can work together to either ensure that they're not excluded and that there are ways to work with them, and also to welcome them back in. And so think about the fact that the behaviours you might be seeing may be trauma-related and not a disability as such, and that may affect readiness. Stigma I didn't mention, but also fear of child removal. Some refugee families won't ask for help because if they do, they think their children are going to be taken away. So there's a lot of work to do with that. So look at ways to connect with the community and help them with transition to a completely different culture. Thank you.